Hello, welcome to the explainer measurement of general consciousness in individuals. So as usual, I'm going to ask you a number of questions, and the idea is that you try to answer these questions before I continue in the video. So pause the video, try to answer the questions, check in with the masterclass, and then return and check your answers. Okay, so the first question is, which disciplines influenced Wundt's psychology? And the answer to this question is that Wundt was influenced by physiology, philosophy, and psychophysics. So let's start with philosophy. His main influence was Immanuel Kant, the idea of a mind that has some structure, and that structure influences the way we perceive the world. So that's very Kantian, and it's there in Wundt as well. But unlike Kant, who thought that psychology cannot be a science because you cannot measure it objectively, and you have to do sort of anthropology. That's what he suggested as a science of the mind. Wundt was completely against that, and what he proposed is a science of the mind. The other main important influence, is physiology. And he was a student, he was a physiologist before becoming the father of psychology. And his mentor was von Helmholtz, a great scientist in the 19th century. So he took from physiology the idea of doing experiments to understand psychological processes. And he also took from physiology the method of applying stimulation to observe a response. Now, he changed what type of stimulation, what type of response he was interested in. So the other discipline is psychophysics. So psychophysics is a discipline that created by Gustav Fachner, who was a physicist and a philosopher, and he used to do experiments. So in a sense, some people may say that psychophysics and Fachner could be the founding father of psychology. But anyway, the history says that Wundt is the founding father of psychology. So, but Fachner was using a very similar method to physiology, but the difference with physiology is that he wasn't interested in behavioral responses to stimulation, like an electric shock applied to a frog, and you observe the movement of the frog. Psychophysics was with humans, and the idea was to provide some stimulation that is not an electric shock, and like it could be a touch in the back, or you have to weigh some objects, and then the response was an experience, the subjective experience of the individual. So these are the three main influences to Wundt's psychology. Next question. What is the object of study of psychology according to Wundt? And the object of study is, I will separate this answer in two parts. So first one is what aspect psychologists should be interested in, according to Wundt, and this is the what we call consciousness, but he called the total experience. So, and what he said is that actually psychology is fundamental. It's the fundamental science, more fundamental than physics, because all the other sciences they all have to deal with the total subjective experience of people. So people have this experience, consciousness, and that's the way we interact with the world, through our experience of the world. So physics is not as pure as we think, because physicists, what they do is they make principles, laws, and even experiments based on the perception they have of the world. And what he says, the difference between psychology and other sciences is that psychology doesn't abstract the subject of the experience out of the experience. And necessarily the other sciences do that. So humans observe the world, different parts of the world, different aspects of the world, different sciences pay attention to different things, but in all those sciences, the subject of the experience is not considered. So that's why psychology studies not only the experience that all the other sciences study, but it focuses on the subject of that experience. So that's the first part. And the second part of the answer to this question is, what aspect of that was important to Wundt? So for Wundt, the importance was, what's the common, so to speak, what is the general human adult mind? So that means he wasn't interested in how people differed. So like Galton's psychology, in which he was interested in individual differences. He measured a lot of people and he was interested in how they differ. Wundt, the opposite. He's interested in how people are the same, the invariances. So that's why he's interested in the general human mind. And his participants in the studies are always adults. He wasn't interested in how the mind changes over time. That doesn't mean that he wasn't interested in development or in cultural issues, but he used a different type of, he studied this in a different way with what he called the cultural psychology or social psychology. But his main studies in psychology are about principles of the adult human mind and things in that we all share and know how we differ. Another question. How does Wundt's psychology differ from physiology and psychophysics? So I answer this question when I explain the influences. So the main, or actually not, I didn't answer. I mentioned what physiology and psychophysics do, but I didn't say how psychology or Wundt's psychology differ from them. So the difference is this. The type of experiment is quite similar to psychophysics. But in psychophysics, perhaps there is also an idea of the subjective experience reported by the participant. By Wundt was very suspicious of the subjective experience as the report of the participant. So he used techniques in order to obtain objective measures. So reaction time is an objective measure. So you present a stimulus and you observe the reaction time. Number of correct answers, so that's again another objective measure. And sometimes there were sometimes reports, but reports about something very specific, a specific characteristic of the stimulus, like the brightness or the weight of the stimulus. But the other important thing is that for Wundt, the experiment has to be guided by theories about psychological principles. Those experiments are done to test those theories. So it's not so he was against inductivism. He wanted to not to accumulate experiments and then see how we can develop a theory from those observations. No, there is a theory about how psychological processes interact, and then that theory is tested in the experiments. So that's why he was keen on the participants of the studies should not be naive like it is today, but they should be psychologists trained in these in the tasks that we perform. So they should actually know about the goal of the experiment rather than being a naive participant. Another question is, what is voluntarism? This is very important because typically, until recently, the idea of the psychology of Wundt that we had and we studied at university, it was a wrong one. It was the psychology called structuralism that Titchener, a student of Wundt in Germany, brought to America. And it was similar in terms of methods, but it became, first of all, very subjective in the sense of asking the participants to report their subjective experience, but also the interest was absolutely different. It wasn't interested in the active components of the mind, like Wundt, but it was interested in the static components of the mind. So he would separate the experience into elements and then identify these small elements that form part of an experience. And for Wundt, that wasn't a good idea. So voluntarism is the name that Wundt gave to his own psychology. And that means that volition, so how people consciously decide what to do, that was something that interested Wundt. Emotions as well was a very important aspect, not just cognition, which was the main interest in philosophers of mind and in psychophysics, for example, before him. So that is a change. Again, he goes against the empirical school of thought of Hume, Locke, Hume, and John Stuart Mill, in which the mind is quite passive, it just makes associations. That is the psychology that Titchener took that type of psychology and what he learned from Wundt and his experimental methods, the objectivity of those methods was what interests Titchener, but not the dynamic aspects. So voluntarism takes into account the idea of a dynamic mind, not a static mind. Next question is, what characteristics do participants have in Wundt's experiments? And the characteristic they have is that they are experts in psychology. They are expert researchers. In fact, Wundt and his collaborators were the participants of these studies, because they had to know about the theory that they were testing in the experiments to be able to participate. So that's completely different than what it is today, that participants have to be naive and know as least as possible about the goals of the experiment. Of course, due to ethical reasons, we need to inform participants on the general characteristics of the experiment, but not in the tiny details and what theory is tested in the experiment. But this was very clear and very different what was in Wundt's psychology and what we do today. Next question is, what are the main differences between the psychology of Galton and that of Wundt? So the main difference was that Galton measured people, large samples of people, and Wundt was the other way around. He used very small samples, and because of these, or as a consequence of these, Galton was interested in how people differed, and Wundt was interested in how people share, what things are shared, so the invariances of psychological processes. So these are the main differences between Galton and Wundt. What is a perception? So this is one of the, Wundt developed a lot of principles of how the mind works, and perhaps the most important is a perception. And a perception is a perception, but it's a holistic perception. So basically, again, the idea is that we don't receive a stimulation and we passively perceive a copy of what's going on out there in the world, but we our knowledge or our structures, they produce they construct what we perceive rather than copying what is out there. So basically that's the concept of a perception. Okay, so what's the legacy of Wundt? First of all, he is considered the founding father of psychology. So psychology, not psychology as a discipline in itself, because psychology, as we saw in these master classes, it's been considered since Aristotle or even before. So what is new in Wundt, and that's why he's called the founding father of psychology, is the scientific aspect of psychology. We can do experiments to test theories of how the mind works. So that's the main legacy. In terms of what this means in itself, but also sociologically, he set up a lab, a psychological lab, to do experiments that are not physiology, that they are not psychophysics, they are psychological experiments. So he had this lab. He mentored many students, hundreds or even thousands of students. And so that's another sociological aspect that influenced the psychology, the progress of psychology after him. Then there are other aspects, more specific aspects, that are very interesting. The issue of theory guiding experiments is something that psychologists a little bit forgot about doing that. That was very strong in Wundt, but it's not as strong today. So today, psychologists are very good at doing a lot of experiments, testing hypotheses, but not very good at developing general theories. Not a theory of how this experiment is done, but general theories about how the mind works. These are missing, and the translation of the theory into an experiment, there is a big gap. So that's something that we should reread Wundt to do a bit more of what he was doing. Another thing is that the concept of a perception is very modern. That was taken by the psychology of Gestalt, not only a perception, but other principles of how we perceive the world, but also the current cognitive psychology. They are ideas similar to that, like the schemas that allow us to perceive the world in a different way, or even schemas that allow us to think in a different way or different ways, or that determine the way we think. So this is another important. Then this idea of using experiments to test theories was followed by a small area in psychology, which is the psychology of expertise. Adrian de Groot, a Dutch psychologist, studied chess players and look at the importance of this. He studied experts and he asked experts to think out loud and to tell what they are thinking. So we are not interested in their feelings about what they feel. No, tell me what you're thinking. And so that's not an introspection as such. It is more about reporting what they are thinking. And that was taken by Herbert Simon, who was an American Nobel Prize laureate, who continues studying chess players and think aloud protocols and other more objective measures as well, to see how people think, how people make decisions, and how memory affects their decisions and their thinking processes. And the idea is to study small number of participants who are experts, so we're not going to use naive participants, but the idea is to generate general theories of the human mind rather than specific theories. So that's another legacy. Of course, the method, objective measures like reaction time, accuracy, and judgments, very specific judgments, these are things that we do every day in psychological science. So another of the legacies of Wilhelm Wundt to psychology. And what is the cause of the demise of Wundt's psychology? A number of reasons. Perhaps the main one is that it was very theoretical and there was a need for psychology to come up with solutions to problems. So when the Second World War started, or even before, between the two wars, and there was a need for psychology to produce things that can be used to solve problems. And this theoretical, very theoretical psychology of Wundt was not ideal. So when Titchener brought the psychology of Wundt to America, it was even drier and more theoretical than Wundt's. So it didn't have a good reception. It was important for a while, but it died very quickly. And then the idea of applied psychology made this very theoretical psychology to not be very popular. Also, the growth of empiricism in the first part of the 20th century made this theoretical, again, theory that guides research not being welcome, and a psychology in which we produce experiments and without theory, and to see the results and accumulate knowledge by experimentation was much more popular, and that was in the behavioristic school became very popular in America. But also sociologically, the center of science moved from Germany to America, and scientists like the Gestalt psychologists who followed Wundt, like some of the principles of their Gestalt psychology were some of Wundt's principles. They have to move away from Germany, they went to America, and in America they tried to fight against the behaviorism and not successfully at the end. So then behaviorism became the most popular psychology, but Wundt's psychology, even it died, a lot of principles were used when cognitive psychology started in the 1950s or 60s, I would say. So there was a sort of return to theoretical research and to the type of measurements that Wundt used.